My name's Bob Wyatt, I'm Director of the Faraday Institute, and Ed Kessler sitting here, you'll hear from this afternoon. Chairing this afternoon is Head of the Woolf Institute. And you might notice this is a brand new building, which the Woolf Institute built. We've just been in it a few months, really. And this is one of the first big workshops in this room, I think. Well, you've had teaching sessions, haven't you? So it's good to have you here, and we thought it would be good for us to combine, to do some things together. The Woolf Institute is interested in relations between Jews, Christians and Muslims, and the Faraday Institute is interested in the relationship between science and religion more generally. So the reason we're having this meeting today is because those two intersect. Woolf have been interested in the hospice movement and so on, and you'll hear from Nav Siddiqui this afternoon. And we've been interested in the effect of technology on human dignity. What does it mean if you're made in the image of God and you're kept alive artificially? And all those sort of questions. And our first speaker has been involved in work like that for some years with us now. So that's why we've set up this meeting, and I realise there's people from lots of different backgrounds, which is great. We've got people who are practitioners at the cold front and some more theoretical ethics people. So it'd be great to span that range. And don't be shy of asking questions. So we've set it up so there's 45 minutes of talk, and then there'll be a good 15 minutes for question and answer, which often I think is the best bit of these talks, because that's where you get to say what's on your mind. I'm going to introduce Professor John Wyatt next, who's sitting just here. He's giving the first talk. He's Professor of Ethics and Perinatology at University College London, and he's also an honorary consultant neonatologist there. And he's been working, as I said, with Faraday for some years on the impact of artificial intelligence on what it means to be human. But he is an expert in end-of-life issues, curiously both at the beginning of life, because he dealt with very, very premature babies, many of whom are very ill, of course, and also he's been thinking more recently at the end of life. So he's got a lot of expertise in that, and we're looking forward to hearing from him. So when he gets off his mobile phone, he'll come and talk to us. Which reminds me to say, it would probably be a good idea to switch off your phone or switch it to silent, otherwise your particular ringtone, which might be embarrassing, will be recorded. Okay, John, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Bob. It's a privilege to be here and to take part in this really exciting day. So as you've heard, my background is particularly in neonatology, the care of newborn babies, and intensive care of extremely sick and some extremely premature babies. And it was really out of my clinical experience working with tiny babies that I became increasingly fascinated by the challenges, the ethical challenges raised by advances in technology. As technology advances, it gives us much more possibility as medical practitioners, but just because we can do something, should we? And how do we know when enough is enough? But I want to start not with a tiny premature baby, but with someone at the other end of life. In 2013, Nelson Mandela was in a critical care unit in Johannesburg. He was 94 years old. He'd suffered from a range of chronic, distressing medical conditions for years. But I was struck by the newspaper headlines, the internet. Fears grow for Nelson Mandela. Family gathers as fears grow for critical Mandela. And one newspaper article reported Nelson Mandela spent a second night in critical condition in hospital on Monday night with his family members, compatriots and well-wishers worldwide, fearing that the anti-apartheid icon is about to lose his final struggle. And I found myself reflecting on the strangeness of that reaction and wondering what exactly the growing fears were about. There was no doubt there were countless millions around the world to which Mandela were well, but what were they so fearful about? Was it so fearful a prospect that a frail 94-year-old man with multiple chronic illnesses might actually die? Was it really terrifying that the final struggle of modern technological medicine against disease and death would be lost? And why should an extremely elderly man's dying be framed in these rather violent terms of struggle and battle. But I think it reflects something wider, doesn't it? That to many modern people, perhaps to most of us, disease and death are the ultimate enemy, and we are now part of that battle, fighting against that ancient enemy with all the powerful tools of modern technology. And one of the obvious differences that's happened just in the last 100 years is that death and dying used to take place at home. At the beginning of the 20th century, less than 15% of all deaths occurred in an institution. The overwhelming majority of people died in bed in their own homes with family and friends at the bedside. Certainly that's how you've expected a well-revered leader like Nelson Mandela to have died, at home, surrounded by family, servants and well-wishers. But now death has become medicalised and the focus has shifted to the hospital and the intensive care unit. When we become seriously ill, we expect to be admitted to hospital, we expect treatment with the latest technology, wonder drugs, brilliant surgery. We know that modern medicine can provide wonderful, even miraculous cures, and we expect that we too will have access to the very best and most up-to-date treatments. After all, we don't go to hospital in order to die, we go there to be restored to health, to get better. But of course the reality is that the battle against death is doomed to ultimate failure. So I like the medical definition of life. Life is a sexually transmitted degenerative condition with 100% mortality. Sometimes doctors, patients and relatives enter into a joint deception to avoid discussing the likelihood of death. The doctors don't want to discuss the possibility of failure, quotes. The relatives don't want to destroy the patient's hope. And the patient is clinging on to the possibility of a medical miracle. And so what I've seen on many occasions is that instead of open and honest discussion about the likelihood that death is approaching, there's a strange and ultimately damaging game of pretense. So in the UK, 4 out of 5 people will die in an institution, and over half will end their lives in a hospital. Only 1 in 20 will die in a hospice. And so the problem is that dying has become a medical event. It's the medical team who tell us what treatments are available for our condition, and the natural assumption is that we will be compliant patients in the unceasing battle against death, passive recipients of whatever therapies are available. And the battle continues until the medics decide that further treatment is hopeless, and then you die. Death has become defined by what doctors can and cannot do. And as theologian Alan Verhey put it, the body of the dying person has become the battlefield where heroic doctors and nurses wage their war against death. I find that a very striking image, isn't it? The passivity and depersonalisation that modern medicine can foster. The unique person with all the wonder and mystery of their life history, their loved ones, their joys and sorrows, has become invisible. Instead, there's just a body and an unceasing battle between medical technology and death. So there seems to be an epidemic of medical over-treatment spreading across the world. And it's interesting to try to reflect on what are some of the drivers of this. Sometimes it seems to be driven by medical arrogance and machismo. Sometimes there are perverse incentives for doctors and for hospitals that reward expensive but futile and burdensome treatments. You can certainly see that in privatised health systems, such as in the States, where, to be honest, patients at the end of their life are an enormous money spinner. They generate huge profits by giving futile and unnecessary treatments. Sometimes medical overtreatment is driven by doctors' inexperience. Sometimes it's fear of litigation. But even very experienced doctors may persist with overtreatment because of a sense that death represents a failure of medical skill and professionalism. Sometimes it's driven by relatives. I think very often it's driven by relatives who demand that every possible treatment be given to their elderly loved one, and who sort of collude in a denial that death is inevitable. So the irony is that after this terrible, witnessing what happened to Nelson Mandela and his repeated hospital admissions at the end of life, his lifelong friend and confidant, Bishop Desmond Tutu, spoke out and said, "The manner of Nelson Mandela's death, prolonged death, was an affront. I have spent my life working for dignity for the living. Now I wish to apply my mind to the issue of dignity for the dying." But ironically, Desmond Tutu then went on to argue that the only way to avoid the passivity and the powerlessness of dying in a medicalised system was to legalise assisted suicide. And so he became and spoke in front of the House of Lords vehemently for the legalisation of assisted suicide. The only way to avoid the powerlessness was to give everyone the right to suicide. So this way every person had the option to take control of their own destiny by killing themselves. So from the perspective of Desmond Tutu, we're confronted with a sort of very tragic choice. Either we die as passive hostages in an impersonal medical battlefield, or we seize control in the only way open to us, by committing suicide. But I have to say that's a very distorted and strange way of looking at the options at the end of life. And I think what this day is all about is trying to see a better way, a way of dying well. But there are many voices arguing that in order to give control at the end of life, you have to legalise some form of medical killing, either physician-assisted suicide, or some kind of euthanasia. Dignity in Dying argue that it's all about choice, it's all about control at the end of life, and we need to know that we have the ability to end our lives if we can. We're aware of many court cases which hit the headlines of where, particularly in my field, in neonatology, and I've been personally involved in cases where parents and doctors have been locked in some kind of conflict about what's the best thing for their baby, and ultimately it's had to go to the courts for resolution of what's often very painful and difficult conflicts. And of course the most striking case of this was the case of Charlie Gard, a tragic case of a young child with a very severe neuromuscular condition which was untreatable and progressive, and he was locked in a body that was completely unresponsive and with very severe and deteriorating brain damage, being kept alive in an intensive care unit by very intensive means, but his parents insisting that everything possible should be done for him and refusing to agree to withdrawal of life support. And as you know, this got splashed around the media and the internet and so on, and it's felt very much like a sort of an episode from one of the medical soaps, Casualty or Holby City or something like that, except that if you were watching an episode of Holby City and then all of a sudden the Pope and Donald Trump got involved, you say, oh, for goodness sake, who wrote this rubbish? It never happened in real life. And the old truth is stranger than fiction. But I think these kind of cases, again, illustrate the terrible difficulties we have as technology becomes so powerful. It's possible for us to keep people, babies, children, adults, elderly people alive almost indefinitely using sophisticated technology. So when is enough enough? Behind a lot of this is fear. It's interesting that studies of the population as a whole have found how high levels of fear are about death, and particularly about the process of dying. Many people describe themselves as terrified, and so this refusal to think about the denial of death becomes very common. It's interesting that dementia has replaced cancer as the kind of dying which people fear most, and the statistics are really quite alarming. These are postulated, estimated figures for the number of people with dementia in the UK: 800,000 in 2012, 1 million in 2021, 1.7 million in 2051. But this is because dementia is an age-related condition, and as the percentage of elderly people in the population increase, I have to say, as I look around this group, myself included, you can see that the elderly population is increasing, and the number of people with dementia are likely to increase unless we find some cure. Dementia is a disease, it's not normal aging, but understanding what that disease process is and how it can be treated is still turning out to be an extremely challenging medical and scientific problem. And of course there are voices saying that as a society we're not going to be able to cope with all these people with dementia. This is Mary Warnock. If you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, you're wasting the resources of the NHS. I'm absolutely fully in agreement with the argument that if pain is insufferable, then someone should be given help to die. But I feel there's a wider argument that if somebody absolutely desperately wants to die because they're a burden to their family or the state, then I think they too should be allowed to die, by which she means they should be killed, given lethal injection or lethal medication. So on the one hand, we have this fear of dying, desire to control death, and on the other hand, we have the idea that technology can extend life almost indefinitely. And there is now a very significant amount of scientific research going on into trying to understand the process of aging so that it could be reversed in some way. There's a lot of interest in telomeres, which are little pieces of genetic code at the end of the chromosomes, which seem to be have a mechanism for limiting the amount of cell divisions that can occur. People are thinking if only we can find how these telomeres work and switch them off and change them in some way, then it would be possible for cells to divide indefinitely, and that the aging process in some way would be limited or restored or even stopped completely. And this rather secretive company, Calico, is actually owned by Google, and Google are putting in very significant sums of money, with the goal being we're tackling aging. And so it's interesting that the whole sort of Silicon Valley, West Coast way of thinking sees aging and death as the ultimate challenge, and in Silicon Valley think there has to be a technological solution. Whatever the problem is, technology will provide the answer if we can throw enough dollars and enough human ingenuity at it. And so there is a very considerable effort coming out of Calico. Perhaps one of the most bizarre and tragic is so-called cryonics, which is the idea that you can have your body inserted into liquid nitrogen and death in the forlorn hope that so each of these vats consist of bodies. If you go for the sort of platinum version, you can have your whole body frozen. If you go for the rather cut price version, you get you decapitated and only your head is preserved, and you just hope that someone is going to keep the liquid nitrogen going in the hope that sometime in the future someone's going to come along and resuscitate you. But I think one of the other striking things that I've noticed is that many technological thinkers express a form of disgust at their own human embodiment. And the sort of stuff that you can read, it's ubiquitous in science, popular science journalism, is this kind of thing. We are pathetic, ludicrous, laughable bipeds who are only fit for survival on the African savannah. Our bodies are a pathetic hodgepodge of partly functioning biological engineering, which is subject to frequent breakdown and inexorable decline. Our brains are dominated by reptilian reflexes from our biological ancestors, which frequently function in inappropriate ways and are maladapted to modern society. Our information processing capacity is limited and subject to frequent errors. Every time we access a memory, we distort and change the encoded file, leading to gross errors. Our perceptions of reality are highly distorted. Our brains create an imaginary reality for survival purposes. And so there is a new narrative which is gaining weight, particularly in the sort of techno-optimist view, and that is, you all are aware of the left-hand side of this narrative, that Homo sapiens emerges by random forces from a primeval swamp and eventually emerges to become the supreme life form on the planet. But lo and behold, it turns out that Homo sapiens is merely a stage in the evolutionary process, and that actually Homo sapiens is going to die out, and the limitations of our biology, carbon-based biology, is always going to be limit what Homo sapiens can always do. So the real future of our race is going to be in the machines we create. And long after Homo sapiens has died out, due to all its carbon-based problems, the machines are going to carry on spreading across the solar system and then ultimately across the planet. And some people have argued that these are our real children, not these pathetic meat children that we have. No, it's our mind children, the machines we make, that are going to carry on into the future. So, an interesting and confusing world in which we live. But I think it's, these ideas of transhumanism, or something called post-humanism, actually, as the science develops, I have no doubt that there's going to be a significant part of the population who are going to grasp onto the idea of enhancing and changing their own human bodies. And I think you can already see a whole series of kind of low-tech transhumanism already into play. I mean, the way that cosmetic surgery is spreading, and to me, one of the really sad things is that the commonest form of cosmetic surgery is breast enhancement, although now genital cosmetic surgery, believe it or not, both male and female, is rapidly increasing, being used. And what seems to be so tragic is that people with perfectly healthy, normally functioning bodies are prepared to undergo mutilated surgery in order to make their bodies conform what is often to a pornographic fantasy, which is sort of perpetrated in many different ways. So the desperate attempt to change our bodies, to somehow make them into fit in with our desires. So we can see this cosmetic surgery, mood and cognition enhancing drugs, gender transition, and drug and genetic doping, anti-aging therapies, even immersive virtual therapy, sort of letting go of this reality and immersing yourself in some other kind of reality. They're all aspects, I think, low-tech versions of transhumanism, a desire to go beyond what normal human functioning can offer. And I think you can see a potent combination here of different forces in our society. Consumerism says, I want. Moral relativism says, well, why not? What's wrong with it? Why shouldn't we allow people to do these kind of things? And then technology says, we can make your dreams come true, but it will cost you. And of course the cost is not just economic, but it's often personal as well. One of the interesting things that these fabulously wealthy Silicon Valley entrepreneurs do is they read science fiction, they come across something interesting, they say, gosh, that sounds good, I think it's going to make it happen. So Elon Musk, who's been in the news recently, a very astonishingly successful entrepreneur, brilliant person, read in science fiction about the idea that you could have implanted underneath your skull a lacework of wires which would then mesh into your body, into your brain, and provide a sort of extremely powerful connection between the human brain and computers. And lo and behold, Elon Musk has decided to make this thing called neural lace, and having millions of connections between brain cells could make a very, very powerful connection with computers. The US military is one of the areas that's putting a lot of work into work on connections between brains and machines, and they've developed a chip which fits into the hippocampus, which is one of the memory encoding centers of the brain, and they're claiming that this is primarily for use with military veterans, with those with brain damage and so on, but there's little doubt that actually their primary intention is to try and make smart soldiers. That basically a huge amount of military research is based on the idea of trying to make technologically enhanced soldiers, so that one of ours is going to be worth 10 of theirs. And it's again, as the technology advances, this is a really bizarre thing. And so this on the right is a rat which has got instrumented electrodes in its brain, and on the left is a human being who is just wearing on his scalp like an EEG electrodes, and by thought alone the human being can make the rat move its limbs, and believe it or not, this is thought to have military applications, that they're making instrumented animals that would be able to find their way across the battlefield. And also, of course, it doesn't take a genius to see the implications of this for human control. And so the technology is frightening, and a lot of this, as I say, is being driven by the US military, but not just the US military, it's also all the major militaries across the world. Russia, China, and elsewhere are investing a lot of money in trying to find means of human enhancement. And in the prescient words of C.S. Lewis, writing at the end of the Second World War, he said, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So often it is about power structures, it's about the strong and their desire to control the weak and the vulnerable. But to come back to this question, what does it mean to die well in the 21st century? If you ask people how they would like to die, most people say, I would like to die in my bed at night. I don't want to have any kind of warning. I just want to go out like a light. How wonderful. No premonition, no experience, just bang, on like that. Wouldn't that be wonderful? I can see a few people nodding around. It's interesting that if you were to go back several hundred years, sudden and unexpected death is regarded as the worst possible way to die. To be catapulted into eternity with no possible means of saying goodbye to your loved ones, no possible means of making preparations, saying the last words, asking forgiveness, preparing to meet your Maker, just to go out like a light, bang, what a terrible way to die. In fact, there is an Anglican collect, I think, which specifically prays against sudden death. Because it's an evil thing, an evil way to die. Isn't it interesting that in our modern society, many people, including many religious people, would feel that actually to go out like a light without any warning was a good way to die. In fact, a lot of people, the majority of people, don't die like that. It's quite unusual to die in a sudden way. And many, many people die like one of these ways. On the left is cardiopulmonary resuscitation, which is a terrible way to die, with people jumping up and down in your chest, electric shocks, and attempts at resuscitation going on and on. Or on the right, in an intensive care unit with tubes coming out of every orifice, and surrounded by anonymous professionals and machinery. Some interesting studies in the States have looked at how people's religious attitudes change the way, or influence the way in which they actually die. And more than one study has shown, at least in the States, that people who use, quote, religious coping as a way of dealing with their own, understanding their life and their death, that positive religious coping was associated with increased preference for heroic medical treatment, lower rates of do not resuscitate orders, and increased use of intensive life-prolonging care in the last bit of life. So paradoxically, it seems that being religious, quotes, doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to be happy to say enough is enough. And when the investigators delve down deeper into these, as to why, they found a number of different reasons, but the two most prominent seem to be, first, well, you have to have every possible treatment, because otherwise that's euthanasia, isn't it? And euthanasia is wrong. And the second explanation was, well, I'm trusting and believing and hoping that God's going to do a miracle and heal me, and if I'm actually having faith, then I have to have every possible treatment to give God the very best chance of doing a miracle. And I've had the same kind of conversation a number of times with religious people whose baby is dying, and who then insist on having intensive care right to the end. So these kinds of arguments are actually common, and they indicate that we need more thoughtful approaches to the whole question of what it means to die well. And I was reading a book by Robert Mull, who was an American writer, and he said that the most common Bible verse, he was quoting a funeral director in the States, he said, the most common Bible verse that families put on funeral announcements or read at services is, I have fought the good fight, as in 2 Timothy. Except they're not talking about spiritual things, they mean this person tried every medical option to stay alive. Paul must be wondering at the use of his epistle. But it does again reveal something, doesn't it, about this battle narrative, fighting the fight to the bitter end. So I've been trying to write a book actually called Dying Well, which is going to come out later this year. And one of the things I've been trying to do is to see it go back to the medieval tradition of the Ars Moriendi and say, is it possible to translate some of this into practical relevance in today's technological world? The Ars Moriendi were documents that were started circulating in the 14th century at the time of the Great Plague and other times. And Europe in the 14th century was a very frightening and dangerous place, and particularly with plague sweeping through. And the great fear about many of the believers at the time, the principally Catholic Church, was that they would die without the presence of a priest, because death would just come very rapidly. And so these self-help documents started circulating, many of them with woodcuts, with pictures of the dying person, and with demons tempting them, and so on. But as somebody has put it, this was like dying for dummies. It was intended for lay people. It was a self-help approach. And it's interesting that it was formulated, it started off with what was called a commendation of dying, an interesting and almost bizarre idea to modern people, that perhaps we'll come back to that. But it then focused on 5 temptations which dying people would be exposed to. And for each temptation there was a corresponding virtue. And it's interesting to look at these, that there's the temptation of doubt, the virtue of faith, the temptation of despair, the virtue of hope, the temptation of impatience, by which I think was meant petulance, anger, and so on, and the virtue of love, the temptation of pride, and the virtue of humility, the temptation of greed, and the virtue of letting go. And I think that each of these temptations we can see, it's an interesting way of trying to help somebody who's facing their end of life see what some of the challenges that they may face, and how both, not just they as an individual, but also how we as a faithful community can help people as they face some of these challenges and temptations. And of course, like all temptations, not everybody is affected by all the temptations. Some people will be more prone to some temptations than others. But I think there's deep wisdom here which we can try to rehabilitate and make available for 21st century, particularly Christian believers, that this ancient tradition can be rehabilitated. And I know there are a number of people who are attempting to do this, and I think it's a very valuable and interesting approach. I would like to add 2 additional temptations which ancient people were not, the medieval people were not at risk of, but I think moderns are. The first is the temptation of the denial of death and the virtue of acceptance. And the 7th is the temptation of self-reliance and the virtue of dependence. So I think that much of what I was talking about before, about the medicalisation of death, a lot of this represents a temptation to deny the reality of death, to try to pretend it doesn't exist, to push it away through technology. But actually, accepting our mortality, accepting that this is part of what it means to be human, clearly is something which, as modern people, we struggle to accept, but it's something we need to learn the wisdom of the past. And for dependence as well, I think that one of the greatest fears for modern people is the idea of ending your life dependent on others, on requiring to be washed and cared and fed for. And yet, dependence is not an alien, subhuman, undignified condition. It's part of the narrative of every human life. Each one of us comes into this world utterly and totally dependent on the care and love of others. And the very fact that you're sitting there and looking reasonably together tells me that when you were born, somebody loved you, somebody cared for you, somebody washed you, somebody kept you warm, somebody wiped your bottom. And it's part of what it means to be human. And then we go through a phase when other people depend on us. and we care for others. And my wife and I, we've got 3 grown-up boys, and we think, good grief, they've left home, thank goodness. All's well, we got there. And then the phone rings, Dad, can you put £1,000 in my account, Dad? So this period of dependence, when other people depend on us, we've now got boomerang children living on the top of the house, you know, our son and his wife. So this period when other people depend on us seems to go on for an awful long time, but you know, most of us are going to end our lives utterly dependent on the love and care of others. And this is not some terrible evil thing. Actually, it's the part of the narrative, it's part of the story of humanity. And this was brought home to me very vividly, the story which I've told before, where I was caring for my mother, or my mother was receiving 24-hour nursing care. She developed horrible kind of dementia, Lewy body dementia, and which required 24-hour nursing care. And she could do absolutely nothing for herself. She was trapped in her body, she was doubly incontinent, she was confused and hallucinating. And near the end I was visiting her and somebody thrust a yogurt pot and a teaspoon into my hand, and I was saying, open your mouth, open your mouth, here it comes, open your mouth, open your mouth. And then I suddenly had this flashback. This was precisely what she used to do for me. In fact, I could even remember her feeding me and coming out and wiping my mouth. And now the tables were turned and I was feeding her. But I remember distinctly thinking at the time, you know, this is the way it was meant to be. I was learning more of what it meant to be a son, and she was learning more of what it meant to be a mother, because dependence is part of the story. It does seem to me that that message, which is just imprinted burdens outweigh the benefits, then our primary responsibility is to stop the treatment, because treatment then becomes a form of abuse and it becomes damaging. Now, of course, the process of balancing benefits and burdens can be extremely difficult and complex, and sometimes one is trying to balance things which seem very different on the two sides of the arms. So in my work as a neonatologist, often I've been confronted with dilemmas to do with, is it right to keep this very premature baby, to carry on giving very invasive treatment, which we know has significant burdens and risks. And I'm trying to balance the burdens of the treatment against the potential benefits, which could be lifelong if this child survives. But there are risks of brain damage and other complications and so on. How do we balance these benefits and burdens? And obviously we have to do that collaboratively with parents, with relatives and so on, trying to find the right way forward. But I think there's another issue here, and that is how we understand evil, how we understand aging. I think on the one hand, the evils of old age are real evils, evils of pain and disability and frustration and memory loss and incapacity. These are real evils, and we mustn't try and sanitize or romanticize. But on the other hand, old age itself is not an evil. It's part of the human narrative, a stage on the journey to be honoured, respected, and even welcomed. So how do we put these decisions into practice? Well, there are various documents that are around that have tried to give greater detail about balancing of benefits and burdens. I think I'm not going to talk about these in great detail. These are taken from a paediatric document about balancing benefits and burdens. I'd be happy to talk about them, discuss them in greater detail if people would like. But in essence, we look at the excessive burdens of treatments themselves, the burdens that a child's underlying condition may give them, and on the other hand, on the benefit side, we look at see how much benefit can my treatment bring. If, because of the severity of a child's condition, actually treatment, however invasive, can only bring very limited benefits, then these are also things that we have to take into account. But I've been very keen to try and emphasize in my own clinical practice and in paediatric teaching the importance of collaboration with parents, that it's a collaborative process. And the same in elderly people, that there should be a collaboration with the patient and with the relatives. And I like the idea of an expert-expert relationship, that we, the health professionals, are supposed to be the experts in terms of treatment options, the likely consequences, disease processes and so on. But patients and parents are also experts. They're experts in their own life history, in their own philosophies and beliefs and things which are important to them. And so what we would need to have is a collaboration, an expert-expert relationship based on mutual respect, based on a dialogue and a quest for consensus. And the expertise which we as health professionals have to bring to the table, it should not be just technical proficiency, but it should include humanity, compassion, wisdom, and ethical integrity. And Cicely Saunders, of course, has been a wonderful example of innovative, creative thinking of care at the end of life. And I once had the privilege of sitting next to a very well-known peer, medical peer, who in the 90s had been leading a committee on whether or not euthanasia should be legalised in the UK. And they visited Holland, and it was widely said that when they saw what was happening in Holland, they were really very upset and appalled by it, and really that was one of the primary reasons why they decided not to recommend euthanasia should be legalised here. And I happened to be sitting next to him, and I said, was that the case? You know, and was that? And he said, yes, it was absolutely true. When we went to Holland, we really were very disturbed by what we saw. And I said, why do you think that euthanasia really took off in Holland, but it didn't take off in the UK? And he said, oh, that's very simple. 2 words, just 2 words only. Cicely Saunders. It's interesting. So just how one person could have, and he was by no means sympathetic, but he could see the power and the influence of in a different approach to the care of the dying. And so Cicely Saunders sort of pioneered, with other pioneers, a whole different way of caring for dying people, in which the intention was neither to accelerate or to impede the dying process, to allow death to occur naturally, but to focus on maximising the quality and the intensity of the life that was available. You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. Not only will we help you to die well, but we'll help you to live before you die. And you don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. And I have, and others have tried to introduce the same kind of approach in the neonatal care, that caring for a dying baby is not fundamentally and philosophically any different from caring for a dying adult. The same goal is to allow death to occur by natural processes, to provide basic care and support, including fluids and nutrition where death is not imminent, but to provide maximum opportunity for private and loving interaction with parents and family. TLC, which for a baby is cuddles. And I conceive of this as, in some ways, what palliative care is a modern version of the practice of hospitality. You know, the basics of hospitality is that you provide care, pain and symptom relief, and you provide food and fluids. That's what you owe to every stranger. Everything else is optional, but the basics of care represent hospitality to strangers. I think a helpful analysis which has come out from the Liverpool Care Pathway, the Liverpool Care Pathway itself, as you know, led to many difficulties, but it led to a helpful review, an official review. And one of the things which has come out of that, which I think is quite helpful, is a way of understanding the progression at the end of life, starting with 6 to 12 months before the end, and then progressing to the final phase when the person is so-called actively dying in those final 48 hours. And I think it's helpful to understand, although everybody's progression is different, yet many people do have this overall progression, and understanding where people are in this progression is quite important and helpful. The NHS has produced a detailed document and protocols for advanced care planning, which I think has a lot of very helpful material. And again, I haven't time to go do it in detail, but it's a very valuable resource. It includes the encouragement for people to make their own statements of wishes and preferences, and the possibility of making a formal legal advance decision to refuse treatment, as well as the lasting power of attorney. So the government is encouraging really that everybody should nominate somebody to have lasting power of attorney for us. And you can nominate them specifically to be make health decisions as well as economic, financial decisions. And the idea, of course, is that we talk to our attorneys and explain to them how we would like to die if we become incapacitated, and they have legal power to take decisions on our behalf. Similarly, we can make formal documents called advanced decisions to refuse treatment, although my own belief is actually these have much more limited value. Atul Gawande has written a very helpful book, Being Mortal, which I recommend, and he particularly highlights two groups of questions which everybody should be asked as they're facing end of life. The first group of questions is, as you look to the future, what are you most worried about? What are your greatest concerns and fears? And it's interesting that the fears are often surprising. When you actually ask people to talk about their fears, it's actually helpful to recognise what their fears are, but they're often quite surprising. For some people, the greatest fears are of medical overtreatment, excessive burdens and intervention. For others, the greatest fears are of medical abandonment and death from neglect and dehydration. So I think that we need to understand each unique person's fears and try to engage with them and help them to have a dialogue with the health professionals, so the health professionals understand what people's deep fears are. One of Cicely Saunders' most profound insights was the concept of total pain, that people facing death didn't just have physical pain, they also had psychological pain, they had relational pain, and they had spiritual or existential pain. And that very often it's these other pains, the relational and the spiritual pains, which are the most profound pains, and that where physical pain doesn't seem to respond to morphine and powerful opioids, the reason is usually not because of medical failure. The reason is because there are other sources of pain, deep spiritual or existential or relational sources of pain, and those are the sources of pain which need to be identified and addressed. But I like this quote, which also comes from the hospice movement. Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. Ultimately, we can't solve every aspect of suffering, but we can be there. We can be the presence with people who are suffering. And Joseph Piper says, love is a way of saying to another, it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in the world. Palliative care is a way of saying to dying people, not that we want to bump you off, but actually it's good that you exist. It's good that you're in the world. And then the second group of questions, as you look to the future, what are your goals for this stage of life? What are the trade-offs you are willing to make and those you are not willing to make? What would you long to happen before you die? And how might we help you to achieve? So on the one hand is the fears, on the other hand are the hopes and aspirations. And how can we help you to, even if those hopes and aspirations may be quite limited, how can we help you to achieve them? So dying well, for all its terror and uncertainty and mystery, is also an opportunity. It's a time for focusing on the things which really matter to me, a time for saying sorry and being reconciled, where there are relationships that need healing, a time for receiving afresh the grace and forgiveness of God, a time for fulfilling dreams that may be accomplished, a time for relinquishing tasks that will not be completed in this life, a time for learning new lessons, a time for passing on to my loved ones the deepest concerns of my heart, leaving a legacy. That's one of the things which I've realised is very important for the dying person. Everybody who is dying needs to know that they are leaving something, and leaving a legacy in some way. A time for encouraging those who remain to serve faithfully, a time for preparing in faith, hope, love to meet my Creator. Thanks very much. It's been a privilege to
Thank you, John. Well, we do have plenty of time for questions or comments, and copies of that book you just flashed up are for sale over there, if you want to pick one up and talk over lunch. So, who'd like to start with questions or comments? It's always hard being the first one, isn't it? Is it helpful to speak into this?
It would be.
Okay. You seem to touch upon
Just point it.
sorry. You seem to touch upon the idea of life being taken.
and you also touch upon gently the idea of life being surrendered. But the question I want to ask is, how does one arrange to lay down their life?
Thanks, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Well, clearly in the battlefield mentality, the idea is that you grasp on desperately, you cling on to the bitter end. But I think that isn't a helpful way of thinking about it. And I think this is the virtue of acceptance, that there comes a time to say that that acceptance is part of what I am being called to do. If I can speak specifically from the Christian tradition, there's a very interesting book called The Stature of Waiting, written by Vanstone. People come across that book, I recommend it. And he points out that in the gospel narratives, in all four of the gospel narratives, there is a point where Jesus goes from being the active, dynamic one, the one who chooses, moves, speaks, heals, and so on, to a point where he is handed over. And from that point on, Jesus becomes almost entirely passive. He is the one who is being done to. And Vanstone builds on this whole idea, and actually this is part of what Christ was modelling for us about the stature of waiting, of acceptance, and the fact that this of being in total control, this fantasy that we can be always in control to the end of our lives, is a fantasy that we have to give up. It's a profound and very countercultural thought, but I think very valuable.
You can pass that back, can you? Thanks.
I'm just going to come from a palliative care perspective at Papworth Hospital, and just a vast amount of, we talked about learning, medics learning from patients, just so much that I've observed in people's culture. So the family's culture, so we're taking it that the beloved person in the bed has a family around them, what the culture of that family is and how they've spoken about things ahead of this time and how they've come to their own thoughts makes such a big part of the puzzle of how this turns out, usually, if we can hope for a good death. It's all about the work that's done within families and all of us outside the hospitals. And if we haven't done those conversations ourselves and come to some sort of idea of what we'd want in the future, then that turbulent journey, that storm, that battle, whatever we've described it as, can change so dramatically because we're in the hands of the medics. I am a medic, so I don't apologise for that, but you know, it's about, my privilege is to walk with people at this time and to see so much good done by families talking about these things, about what they want ahead of their time, and I couldn't emphasise that enough really. And I think we need to help the medics know when to let go because they find it so difficult.
Thanks very much. And yet it's extraordinarily difficult to have those conversations, isn't it? I mean, I think we all know in theory we ought to be having those conversations, but actually, I know in my own family with elderly relatives how extraordinarily difficult it's been. In fact, I got my elderly parents-in-law to read the manuscript of this book on dying well to give as a sort of as a means to encourage having a conversation.
Yeah.
We have just made a part of a guide for our children, and they have said that they would like us also to write in the things that we would actually want. And I'm very unclear about what things you can suggest you don't want done at the end of life, and how to draft a simple document.
Yes, thanks very much. Well, these are not easy documents to write, and I think that the problem of writing, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want the other, is that it's very difficult to predict what actually the situation is going to be. And it's possible for you to write, I don't want this, and for the medics to say, well, she said she didn't want this, when actually the medical situation that's being applied is completely different from the one you imagined. So I think, in general, what's most helpful is to write positively about what you positively would like. Yes, you can talk about that. I mean, so these two questions. What are you most frightened of? What do you not want to happen when you're dying? And secondly, what do you really want to tell people? This is what I want to do positively. And that is not just the medical things. It's about who would I like to be there? Where would I like to die? Who would I like to be there? What kind of values do I want the medics to take into account when they're trying to decide whether or not to give you treatment? And what are the things that really matter to you? What are the, you know, I'm very frightened that I might end up dying of dehydration or something like that. So then say that, and then say, I want to make, if there's a question, I would much prefer to receive medical treatment with fluids or whatever. Or it may be, I'm very frightened of dying in an intensive care unit with tubes coming out of every orifice, and I'd much prefer, if that was thing, to be transferred home and to be able to die at home rather than die in hospital. Those are the kind of general statements of wishes and preferences, which is actually very helpful for medics when it's written down like that. But it's also actually very helpful to discuss it with your children and let them know what are the things you're worried about and what are the things that you really would like to happen.
Thank you.
Just a practical question, why is hydration such a problem?
It's a very complex issue, this issue about what's called medically assisted hydration and nutrition. What everybody knows, that when people are dying naturally of a pathological process, such as cancer or pneumonia or something like that, is that people stop eating and drinking as you approach death. And most people don't experience particular thirst or hunger. It seems as part of the process of the body shutting down is that the normal desire to drink and eat is lost. And also there is physiological evidence showing that you don't actually need much in the way of fluid. And as the body is cutting down, the body doesn't need much in the way of fluids. And so there is evidence that if you say, well, you know, this person stopped drinking, therefore we have to put up a drip, we have to push fluid into the body, you do actually often create medical problems with fluid overload because the body doesn't need the fluid, but now you're saying, well, you're jolly well going to have the fluid. On the other hand, even if people don't need much in the way of fluid, they may experience thirst, and of course if they do experience thirst, we should do everything possible to help people overcome the experience of thirst. It may be that their body can't tolerate much in the way of liquids, but things like ice cubes and mouthwashes and lemon and lots of ways can help people to overcome this experience of thirst, even if the body isn't able to tolerate taking fluids. But I think it goes back to these unfortunately, the Liverpool Care Pathway, which was a well-meaning attempt to take the wisdom that had come out of Cicely Saunders and the palliative care movement and apply it into a standard NHS hospital where you had inexperienced medics and nurses, often with very little experience of caring for dying people, trying to work out what the best thing to do was. And they produced this very complicated tick box approach, which sadly just didn't work, and there were some terrible examples where inexperienced people were saying, well, it says no eating, so they can't eat, no, can't drink, can't have anything, you know, just terrible things going on. And I think that has led to a lot of fears, understandable fears, that people are going to get dehydrated to death, and so then people are demanding, insisting on having invasive treatments, nasogastric tubes, drips, fluids, and so on. So I think these are complex issues. What you most need is a good dialogue between experienced doctors and nurses and relatives and patients, together deciding what is the best in each individual case.
I was going to say this will be the last question, I think, because then we should get on. There's two questions here. I saw your hand first.
John, that was a brilliant paper. But you set yourself the question, when is enough enough? I'm not sure if you answered it. What you did was you provided this incredible context about how one might go about answering it in today's technological age. I don't think you did, and I'm just wondering if you can. Is it the balance between treatments, benefits versus burdens? I mean, where do you personally sit in terms of answering that question, or is it just that down to each individual case as a kind of ad hoc answer?
Yeah, thanks. It's a very difficult answer. I think it is, my ultimate answer would be it's in the collaboration between experienced medics who do understand about the balances of burdens and benefits, and me. It's this expert-expert relationship that I have my own unique perspectives, philosophies, concerns. They have their professional expertise and understanding of therapeutic options. Together we collaborate and decide, is this point the point at which enough is enough?
Thanks, we're going to pull stops there. I'm sure these topics will keep coming up during the day, and John will be around during the day as well.